In the summer of 1867, the air in Sedalia hung heavy with heat and silence, broken only by the distant clatter of horse hooves and the rustle of wind through scorched cornfields and brittle grass. It was the kind of heat that made men restless and animals skittish, the kind of heat that bled into the bones of old farmhouses and left mothers too tired to speak and fathers too worn to dream. And it was in this stifling quiet that Timothy Caldwell arrived, a boy of 8 with a face too still and eyes too pale, born into a world already broken by the war that had taken everything from the people around him. And yet he walked through that world untouched, as though grief and hardship were things that did not know how to cling to him. Dr. Samuel Harding had practiced medicine long enough to know that people lie not always with words, but with posture, with silence, with the weight of a handshake, or the way the eyes flinch when you say the name of the dead. But Timothy Caldwell did not flinch, and he did not lie, not with words or posture or silence. Instead, he offered a kind of honesty. That was worse than lies, because it left no room for interpretation, no space to imagine that you had misunderstood. He would look directly at you with those cold blue eyes and tell you that he had found Mary Fletcher's body floating face down in Willow Creek, and his voice would not waver, not even once. And when he described the exact position of her limbs and the way her dress was caught on a submerged branch, it did not sound rehearsed or forced. It sounded like he had seen it, not just with his eyes, but with something deeper, something clinical, something that took joy, not in the tragedy itself, but in the act of observing it. D.R. Harding had first met Timothy in June of the previous year, when the boy had accompanied his uncle Thomas Caldwell into town to buy seed and tools. Timothy had stood quietly by the wagon hands, clasped behind his back posture, perfect head slightly tilted, watching the blacksmith hammer red iron on the anvil. And when Harding introduced himself, the boy had smiled politely and said, "Yes, sir," and met his eyes, and Harding had felt a tightness in his chest that he could not explain. He had seen that look once before during the war in the eyes of a young Union soldier who had stood on the edge of a field full of the dying and stared down at the carnage with quiet fascination, as if wondering how the body worked when it stopped being alive and started being just a thing. The Caldwell farm sat 15 miles south of town, nestled in a valley that held heat like a furnace and secrets like a grave. It had once been prosperous, the kind of place where corn grew high and cattle fattened on sweet grass. But those days had died with James Caldwell at Wilson's Creek and his wife, Martha, 2 years later, coughing blood into linen until there was nothing left to cough, and their son. Thomas had inherited more debt than land and more sorrow than purpose. And so when word came that his brother William had died in a Confederate prison, leaving behind a widow and a son, Thomas had accepted the boy not out of love or duty, but because labor was scarce and children could be worked like men if you knew how to keep them afraid. Timothy arrived in the spring of 1866, carrying a cloth bag and a face that looked carved from pale wood, his skin burned in the sun, and his aunt Sarah kept his blonde hair cut short to avoid lice and discipline him when needed. And though she claimed the boy had never once cried under the switch, her voice betrayed something like unease. When she said it, he never cried, she repeated to Harding during one of his visits. Not once, not when he bled, not when I used the willow, not even when I broke. Skin just looked at me like I was teaching him something useful. Timothy did not speak much of his life before the farm, said only that his father had been a soldier and his mother had died coughing, and that he had lived with neighbors for a while before coming to live with the Caldwells. He worked from sunup to sundown without complaint, never played, never rested, and when asked why he did not take time for himself, he simply said, "I like to keep busy, sir. It helps the days go faster." And then he would return to the field and move through the rows like a shadow, long and silent, and always watching. The first death came in August, a child named Mary Fletcher, 5 years old, bright and curious, and known for wandering too far from home, she had been playing near Willow Creek, and then she was gone, and it was Timothy who found her, or said he did. Arriving at the Fletcher house just before supper, his clothes wet and his face pale with what looked like grief, though his voice was steady and his hands were clean, and he said, "Mrs. Fletcher, I found Mary by the creek. She's not breathing." And when they followed him, they found the girl exactly where he said they would, lying in water, barely a foot and a half deep, her arms at her sides, and her face turned toward the reeds. Harding was called to examine the body and found nothing inconsistent with drowning. The lungs were waterlogged, the skin pale, the mouth open and blue, but it was Timothy's account that bothered him. The boy described the scene with alarming detail, noting the color of the water, the drag marks in the mud, the way Mary's dress had snagged on a branch, and when asked how he had come to be in that precise spot, he said he was looking for a lost calf and had heard nothing unusual, just saw the body and ran for help. Harding wrote in his journal that evening, "The child displays an unsettling level of composure for someone who claims to have discovered the corpse of a peer. His recounting of the event includes details that suggest not panic, but careful observation. It is as if he recorded the moment, rather than experienced it as if it were data, not trauma. And though I am not given to superstition, I cannot shake the sense that there is something unnatural in this boy." At the funeral, Timothy sat between his aunt and uncle, his head bowed, his hands folded perfectly in his lap, and when Mary's mother collapsed in sobs, Timothy did not move his eyes, remained dry and calm, and when he thought no one was watching, they flicked upward and scanned the faces around him, taking in the grief, the tremble of shoulders, the red-rimmed eyes, the scent of loss in the air. And Dr. Harding watched him from across the aisle and felt again that tightness in his chest, as if he were standing in the presence of something that was not a child, not in the way most men understand children to be. 3 weeks later, it was Henrik Len, a retired logger, found broken at the bottom of Devil's Bluff, a rocky outcrop above the same creek where Mary had died, and once again it was Timothy who discovered the body, said he had seen Henrik's hat caught in a thorn bush and climbed down to investigate, and there he had found the man, neck-twisted limbs, splayed bees scattered around his body like fallen petals. And when Harding examined the scene, he noted that the bees were too concentrated, that the hive above was undisturbed, and that something about the arrangement felt staged, as if the death had been curated for effect. Timothy offered an explanation, said perhaps Henrik had been stung, lost his footing, fallen, and the story held, but Harding could not ignore the pattern. The boy was always near death, always composed, always watching. And when asked how he felt about the man's passing, Timothy said, "I didn't know him well, but it's sad when people die, especially alone." And his tone was so measured, so correct, that Harding felt the words land like stones in his gut. But the most disturbing case came in September, when Jacob Mills, age 6, vanished from his yard while playing with a wooden soldier, and was found 4 days later at the bottom of a well hidden beneath brush and debris. And once again, it was Timothy who led the searchers to the site, claimed he heard crying in the woods, and had followed the sound until he found the well. And Jacob was still alive, then barely conscious, lips, cracked eyes sunken, and he died within hours of rescue. And Timothy sat beside the fire in the Mills cabin, his hands clasped his lips, moving in what looked like prayer, but his eyes were fixed on Jacob. And Harding later wrote, he was not praying, he was studying the child's decline with the interest of a scholar, watching the dying as one might observe the setting sun. The well had been camouflaged too well to find by accident logs arranged with purpose brush, positioned to conceal, and when Harding examined it later, he realized that someone had gone to great lengths to hide it until the boy inside could not be saved, and his notes became darker, filled with questions. He could not ask aloud, how did Timothy find it so easily? Why did he wait until dawn to alert the family? If he heard crying, why did no one else? And what does a child know of the human body and death that makes him ask how long it takes to die, or how much someone screams when they lose a limb? The days grew shorter and the air colder, and Harding began to feel that he was circling, something that had no center, that what he was witnessing was not the work of coincidence or misfortune, but the deliberate acts of a mind that did not know. Compassion only curiosity, and when Timothy asked him during a routine visit how long a person could survive without food, Harding lied, said 2 days, maybe 3, and Timothy nodded, slowly filed the answer away, and said softly, "I thought it might be longer," and then smiled and said nothing more. And Harding left that day with the weight of his suspicion pressing down on him like the air in summer, thick and suffocating, and filled with things he could not say, and as he rode back into town, he looked once over his shoulder toward the valley, where the Caldwell farm lay, and for the first time in his life he was afraid not of disease, not of war, not even of death, but of a boy with pale eyes and a polite smile, who had seen too much and felt too little, and who watched the world not as a place to live in, but as a thing to be taken apart and studied piece by trembling piece. And the story of Timothy Caldwell was only beginning. It was not uncommon in those years after the war for children to be passed around like surplus tools from one household to another. Some were taken in out of pity, some for labor, most for reasons. Somewhere in between, and Timothy Caldwell's arrival at the farm was never marked by ceremony or welcome. There were no toys, no soft words, no fresh clothes folded at the end of a bed. There was simply work and silence and a narrow bed of straw. In the back room beside the stacked feed sacks and broken chairs, and he made no complaint, not on the first night, not on the second, not even after a month, when the chores began to stretch from before dawn to well after the moon had risen, and Aunt Sarah's discipline grew more frequent and less restrained. He simply obeyed. Thomas Caldwell rarely spoke to the boy except to issue orders or corrections. His own grief having calcified into bitterness and drink, he spent his evenings slumped in a wooden chair that creaked with each breath, a bottle in one hand and a ledger of unpaid debts in the other, while Sarah sharpened her tongue against every surface. She touched her voice, slicing through the stale air of the kitchen like a rusted knife. Timothy moved through this landscape like a shadow, never intruding, never resisting, absorbing every insult, every blow, with a calm that unsettled more than defiance ever could. The neighbors who caught glimpses of him in the fields began to speak in hushed tones. Mrs. Alalanina Patterson was the first to put her unease into words, said there was something wrong in the way he worked, how he never slowed, never paused, how even the horses avoided his touch, how the chickens scattered when he passed by, and not in the usual flurry of wings and feathers, but with a shrill terror that made her skin crawl. She told her husband one night after seeing him stand perfectly still for over an hour in the rain, watching a dying lamb bleed out from a coyote's bite, not moving to help, not crying, not even blinking, just standing there, hands at his sides, eyes fixed on the animal's shuddering breath. And it was that stillness that began to unsettle the adults. More than anything else, children fidget, they ask questions. They sneak sweet bread and throw stones and run when no one is chasing. But Timothy did none of these things. He was all silence and observation and obedience, too precise, too contained, and it made people whisper the way farmers whisper about ruined crops or sick cows, like there's a blight in the soil that no one dares name. Dr. Harding continued his visits partly because Thomas Caldwell had begun to suffer from back spasms, brought on by years of hard labor, and partly because he could not let go of the feeling that something inside that farmhouse was quietly growing. Wrong like mold behind wallpaper, the boy was always present during his examinations, standing in the corner or behind the door, never speaking unless spoken to, but always watching, not with the curiosity of a child, eager to learn, but with the intense, focused gaze of someone cataloging information for later use. It was during one of these visits that Harding first noticed the drawings Timothy kept hidden in the rafters of the barn. Crude sketches, made in charcoal on bits of feed sack and flattened boxes. Most showed animals, goats, pigs, birds, some whole, some cut open, but all drawn with a precision that suggested not imagination but memory. And beside, some of the drawings were notes, not misspelled ramblings of a farm boy, but carefully worded. Observation: subject ceased movement after neck was twisted approximately 120 degrees. Noted delay in vocal cessation. Following incision across chest cavity. Harding did not confront him not, and instead he folded the images into his medical bag and said nothing as he rode back to town, the wind cold against his neck. That evening he lit a lamp and laid out the drawings on his desk, and as the flame flickered across the paper, he felt a kind of sickness rise in him, not just from the content, but from the implication, because these were not fantasies. These were records, and that meant the acts had been performed, not imagined, and he began to ask himself questions he had tried not to consider for weeks. What if the deaths were not accidents? What if the livestock injuries were not random? What if the boy was not merely observing the world around him, but changing it, bending it, testing it? He returned the next day under the guise of checking on Thomas's back pain, and while Sarah prepared tea and muttered about the state of the kitchen, Harding asked Timothy if he could help bring water from the spring. The boy nodded and walked beside him without speaking, and once they were out of earshot, Harding stopped him and asked what he thought happened to Mary Fletcher. The question was blunt, a surgeon's incision, and Timothy answered with the same calm he applied to every topic. "She drowned, sir," he said softly, "probably slipped on the rocks. The creek bed is slick with moss this time of year." Harding watched him closely, asked if he had seen her slip or heard her fall, but Timothy only shook his head and said, "I only found her, sir, like I said before." And then he looked up and added, "Sometimes people just vanish like smoke. 1 minute there, the next they're gone." And it sounded rehearsed, not the words, but the cadence, like something he had told himself over and over, until it became a truth he could wear like a coat. As October crept in the air, turned brittle and gray, the harvest began, and Thomas's condition worsened, and Harding's visits became daily. He used the time to speak more with Sarah Caldwell, who had begun to show signs of fatigue, not physical, but emotional, a kind of drawn-out weariness that made her mouth tremble when she tried to smile, and Harding noted the way she avoided Timothy's presence, the way she flinched when his footsteps echoed in the hallway once he found her standing in the pantry, staring at a spilled jar of preserves, unmoving. And when he asked if she was all right, she whispered, "I can't hear him walking, he just appears. He's always just there." And then she blinked and shook her head and said it was nothing, just the nerves. It was that same week when the first story of missing tools came from the Wickham farm. 2 knives, gone a pair of shears, nothing extraordinary. But Wickham mentioned it to Harding, offhandedly said he figured one of the neighbor boys had taken them. For mischief, Harding asked which neighbor, and Wickham shrugged, but said, "I did see that Caldwell boy near the fencing line around that time. Quiet one, walks like a ghost. You'd think he was spying, if he didn't always smile so damn polite." And that was the word, polite, always polite, and Harding began to see it not as a virtue, but as camouflage. One night after a storm rolled through and felled an old oak near the Caldwell property, Harding made an excuse to ride out late, claimed he needed to check on Thomas's leg, said weather changes might aggravate it. Sarah answered the door, looking older than he remembered, her hands trembling as she poured coffee, and when Harding asked where Timothy was, she hesitated before saying he's gone to bed, but her voice betrayed uncertainty, and Harding excused himself to check on Thomas, and as he passed the back room he noticed the door ajar, the straw mattress empty, and the window open, letting in the sound of the wind. He left the farmhouse quietly and circled toward the woods behind the barn, and it was there, he saw the faint flicker of lantern light in the distance moving steadily deeper into the trees, and he followed slowly, boots sinking into damp leaves, breath shallow and tight in his chest, until he reached the edge of a clearing, and what he saw there was enough to root him to the spot. Timothy stood in the center of the clearing alone, holding a small knife in one hand and a rabbit in the other, the animal limp and trembling, the light from the lantern casting long shadows across his face. He set the rabbit on a flat stone and began to speak, not in gibberish, not in ritual, but in the same calm voice he used when discussing farm chores, noting the placement of organs, the reaction to incision, the sounds of distress, and Harding watched frozen as the boy made cuts with precision and ease, no hesitation, no cruelty, just curiosity. He stepped backward, a twig cracked beneath his boot. Timothy turned his head slowly, not startled, just aware, and in that moment, Harding saw not a child, not even a boy, but something wearing the shape of a child, something that did not blink or tremble, something that looked at him as if measuring not whether he would run, but how fast and how far, and Harding turned and walked away as calmly as he could until he reached his horse and did not look back. That night he began writing in earnest, filled an entire page with a single sentence. He does not feel anything, not pain, not joy, not remorse. And beneath it he began to compile a list, dates, names, symptoms, injuries, patterns, and though he tried to rationalize it, tried to explain it as childhood trauma or psychological disturbance, the truth sat heavy in his gut. This was not damage. This was design. This was intention. And if Timothy Caldwell had started with animals, it would not end there. Because every experiment escalates. Every mind that seeks understanding demands a new threshold, a new challenge, and there are only so many rabbits and chickens in the valley. By November, the leaves had fallen, and the mornings came white with frost, and still the boy rose before dawn. Still, he worked without complaint. Still, he smiled with perfect manners, and the neighbors still whispered, and the animals still died, and Dr. Harding wrote and watched and waited, wondering, not if, but when, and the wind carried the first breath of winter through the bare trees, and somewhere, in the silence, a boy stood at the edge of a field, watching it all unfold, eyes pale as ice hands, folded just so, waiting for the next test, the next lesson, the next name to carve into his memory, like a surgeon marking flesh before the cut. The first time Dr. Samuel Harding truly saw Timothy Caldwell, not as a boy, but as something else entirely, was on a morning so still it felt like the world itself had paused just to listen. The fields were slick with dew, the sky a low-hanging gray sheet that pressed against the earth, and he had ridden out early to check on Thomas Caldwell's worsening condition. The man had been bedridden for days, his spine curling in on itself with each failed harvest and too much unspoken grief. But Harding's eyes were not on Thomas. They were on the boy who stood at the edge of the yard, facing the rising sun, unmoving, as though carved from the very wood of the barn. And what struck Harding was not the stillness itself, but the posture, hands clasped behind, his back head tilted very slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. Harding called to him gently, the way a man calls to an animal he's unsure will bolt or attack, and Timothy turned with a smile that was perfectly shaped, polite, as always, but it did not reach his eyes. They remained cold and distant like glass over ice, and Harding noted this. In his journal later that night, wrote that the boy's expression reminded him of a surgeon preparing for amputation, calm, focused, entirely removed from the weight of human consequence. He began observing the child more directly after that, speaking to neighbors under the guise of routine medical visits, asking pointed questions without seeming to pry. And what emerged was a pattern too precise to ignore, not merely the deaths or the animals or the tools that vanished, but the way the boy inserted himself into every scene of tragedy like a ghost that left no footprints, always nearby, always helpful, always watching Mrs. Eleanor Granger, said she saw him once behind her barn. Crouched low beside a dying calf, whispering to it as if it could understand, and when she called out, he stood and smiled and walked away without a word, and when she reached the calf, its eyes were wide with fear, and blood leaked slowly from a precise incision just beneath its jaw, the kind of wound a veterinarian might make during a dissection, not the clumsy tear of a predator. And what grew darker still was the realization that no one could remember him ever laughing, not once, not even when the Patterson twins tried to teach him to skip stones, or when old Widow Jacobs baked him sweet corn muffins because he reminded her of a son lost in the war. He would eat, politely say, "Thank you, sir, thank you, ma'am," and then go back to his tasks, always alone, always too quiet. And when other children cried or scraped knees or lost their tempers, Timothy would watch them with something like curiosity, never joining, never intervening, just absorbing every detail, like a painter studying form and movement and light. Harding tested him more deliberately, now during visits, asking him questions meant to confuse or provoke, but the boy never faltered, never flinched. He would answer calmly, correcting the doctor once when he misstated the name of a bone in the human wrist. Another time, when Harding fabricated symptoms to see if the boy would catch the lie, he did every time, and did so without pride or challenge, simply noted the error and moved on as if cataloging a discrepancy in a ledger. It was during one such visit that Harding noticed a scratch on Timothy's hand, deep and clean, just along the knuckle, and when asked about it, the boy said he had cut himself splitting wood, but Harding's eyes caught the faint residue beneath the boy's fingernails, a dark crust that was not sap or dirt, and when he examined it later under the lens of his study lamp, he confirmed what he had already suspected. It was dried blood, and not the boy's. The composition was wrong, the thickness too watery and thin, as if taken from a smaller animal, one recently dead. He returned the next day, unannounced, and under the pretense of checking on Sarah Caldwell, who had begun to show signs of nervous fatigue, her hands trembling even when she sat still, her voice brittle and uncertain, and when asked how she was sleeping, she simply looked toward the room where Timothy slept and said, "I hear him sometimes walking, but there's no sound. His feet don't make sound on the floorboards, not like ours do." And Harding did not ask more, because he could see that even speaking of it cost her something she wasn't ready to spend. That afternoon he followed the boy discreetly as Timothy made his way into the woods, carrying a small cloth sack slung over one shoulder, his movements deliberate, his path winding through the underbrush with the ease of someone who knew every root and stone, and Harding kept his distance, careful not to snap twigs or disturb branches, until he saw the boy stop at a low thicket and kneel, and what emerged from that sack was not tools or food, but a small kitten barely old enough to walk. Its fur matted its eyes wide with terror, and Harding could not move, could not breathe as he watched Timothy lay the animal down, gently stroke its back, whisper something too soft to hear, and then remove from his coat pocket a sliver of glass, curved and sharp, the bottom of a broken bottle, perhaps, and with terrifying precision make a series of incisions along the animal's abdomen, not out of cruelty, not with anger, but the same detached interest Harding had seen only once before in a field hospital, where a young surgeon fresh from the city had performed an unnecessary amputation just to see if he could. He left before the boy looked up, made his way back to town in silence, and wrote late into the night, the lamp burning low, as he tried to make sense of what he had seen, but the words failed him again and again, and he found himself staring at the wall behind his desk, where the shadows shifted like figures waiting to be named. The next morning he received word from the Patterson farm that another calf had died, found with its throat open neatly, its heart missing, and Harding felt the sickness rise again in his chest, because he knew this was not about death. It was about understanding. It was about studying how it happened, how long it took, what it looked like from the inside. And Timothy Caldwell was not just learning, he was testing hypotheses. Each death, each injury, each tragedy a step in a silent curriculum no one else could see. And what terrified Harding most was not the boy's actions, but the lack of motive. There was no revenge, no anger, no signs of abuse that might explain. The darkness, no hunger for attention or power or love, only the pure cold engine of observation. And it reminded him of something he had once read in a French medical journal, a description of a young man who had spent his childhood dissecting insects, then birds, then stray cats, and who had gone on to become a surgeon of great skill and great secrecy, who had vanished one day, leaving behind only notebooks filled with sketches and formulas and a final entry that read, "I have found the soul, and it is meat." That night Harding returned to the cave he had once seen Timothy vanish into a low opening at the base of a limestone bluff, hidden by brambles and old branches, and inside he found what he feared, but had not allowed himself to imagine a crude table fashioned from planks and stone, a lantern still burning. Low in the corner, a smell like spoiled meat and wet leaves, and along the walls were drawings pinned with nails, carefully rendered in charcoal, and chalk, some of animals mid-dissection, some of children, including one that looked unmistakably like Mary Fletcher, her arms splayed eyes, empty mouth agape, and beside it notes in a careful hand. Observed final breath after 3 minutes 17 seconds, applied pressure to chest cavity at 2:41. Signs of seizure commenced at 2:45, termination at 2:52, and Harding stumbled from the cave, unable to breathe, heart-pounding hands shaking with a fear so old it felt ancestral, and he knew then that this was not simply evil, it was a different species of intelligence, one that studied suffering as a clockmaker studies gears not out of malice, but necessity. He returned home and began copying the sketches, began writing letters to medical colleagues in St. Louis and Boston, asking quiet questions about childhood pathology, about early indicators of psychopathy, about what might be done when the patient is not simply broken, but engineered, and he burned the original sketches, not out of fear, but to contain something he could no longer unsee, and for the first time since the war, he dreamed of blood. And Timothy Caldwell continued to work, continued to smile, continued to pass unnoticed by a world that saw only what it wanted to see: a quiet boy on a lonely farm in the middle of off Missouri, with pale blue eyes and a soft voice and hands that held life like a lantern, to be studied, dissected, extinguished. And Harding knew the deaths would not stop. They would only grow more refined, more deliberate, more distant, until one day the boy would leave that valley and the world would forget him again. Until somewhere else the pattern would begin anew, quiet, polite, surgical. It was the sound of rushing feet over hard ground that reached Dr. Harding before the knock ever came, the kind of sound that belongs to desperation. Not urgency, not panic, but something quieter and deeper, the sound of someone already halfway to grief. And when he opened the door to find John Fletcher standing there, soaked in sweat and mud, holding his hat in hands that trembled like autumn leaves, Harding already knew something had happened to blacksmiths. Lips parted and closed twice before sound came out, and when it did, it came not as speech, but as the barest thread of sound. "Timothy found her. He said he found our Mary. She's dead." And the name hit the air like a hammer, not because of what it meant, but because of who had spoken it and who it involved. Harding's mind immediately leapt over the man's shoulder to the boy, with pale eyes and quiet hands, and he felt the cold settle behind his ribs like a second heart, beating slower, heavier, one that had known all along this would come. By the time Harding reached Willow Creek, the sky had gone that strange bruised color that Missouri evenings often carry in late summer, the kind of color that hangs in the air like a warning, and there gathered along the edge of the shallow water were half the townsfolk, boots sunk in mud, voices, hushed faces, twisted by the kind of sorrow that belongs to those who still cannot believe what they are seeing. The little girl lay face down in no more than 18 inches of water, her blonde hair fanned out in a halo. Across the surface caught on a branch, her dress soaked and clinging to her small form. And what struck Harding first was the neatness of it. There was no chaos, no sign of struggle. The scene looked arranged, positioned, like something someone had meant to be found. Timothy stood back from the crowd, near the edge of the brush, clothes damp hands folded, his expression unreadable. He was not crying, he was not speaking. But when Harding stepped into his line of sight, the boy met his gaze directly, and something. And that gaze held Harding there like a nail through flesh, not because of what it said, but because of what it didn't. It was not fear, it was not guilt. It was something far more unsettling. It was expectation. He found her, Harding said quietly to John Flesher. The blacksmith nodded, said he came to the house near supper, said he found her by the creek, said she wasn't breathing. And when I ran out here, I thought maybe, just maybe, and his voice cracked like wood under pressure, and Harding placed a hand on the man's shoulder because there was nothing else to give. Later, when the body was taken home, when the grieving began, when the mother's wails filled the farmhouse like the cries of a wounded animal, Harding took Timothy aside, gently alone, under the pretense of thanking him for his help, and asked him plainly, "How did you find her, Timothy?" And the boy looked at him with that same still expression and said, "I was looking for a calf. It had gotten loose earlier. I thought it might have come to the creek for water, and then I saw something white in the water, and it was Mary." And Harding nodded, because it was a reasonable answer, and because anything else would have required believing the unbelievable. But then he asked, "And what did you do?" And Timothy said, "I went to the house, told Mr. Fletcher. I didn't touch her. I just told them where she was." And Harding said, "You saw her in the water?" And Timothy nodded and said yes, and then said her eyes were open at first, but not moving. And Harding felt a tick behind his eye, a twitch that never came before the war, and asked, "How could you see her eyes if she was face down?" And Timothy blinked once slowly and said, "I rolled her over to check, and then rolled her back and went for help." And Harding knew the boy was lying, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it, the cadence too, smooth, the detail too perfect, as though it had been rehearsed. And in his journal that night, Harding wrote the child recalled the position of the body, the snag of the dress on her branch, the color of the water around her face. He knew she was dead, not guessed, not feared, knew. And that kind of certainty does not live in children. At the funeral, Timothy sat beside his aunt and uncle, back, straight head, bowed lips, moving in quiet prayer, but across the aisle. Harding watched him without blinking, and what he saw chilled him more than any death had ever done. He watched as Mary's mother collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, watched as grown men wept, openly watched as pain carved its mark on every face in that church. And through it all, Timothy never moved. His face remained the same calm, detached mask of solemnity. But when he thought no one looked, when the attention shifted to the servant, Harding saw the boy's eyes scanning the room, cataloging every expression, every twitch of anguish, every sob and flinch and tear. And it was not curiosity, it was something colder, it was analysis. After the service, when the Fletcher family approached him with thanks, Timothy accepted it with grace, told them, "I wish I could have found her sooner," said it with exactly the right tone, the right break in the voice. But Harding now knew how easily the boy adopted these masks, and how easily others accepted them, because of his age, because of his politeness, because no one wants to believe a child could wear the face of something else. Later that week, Harding returned to the creek alone under cover of dusk, the light long gone, the insects thick in the air, and he crouched beside the place where the girl had been found, noting the depth of the water, the location of the snagged branch, the angle of the sun at the time she was supposedly discovered. And what he found disturbed him more than he expected. There was no way a child could accidentally drown here, not without injury, not without struggle. The bed of the creek was Smooth the water still, the current barely strong enough to move leaves. And when he knelt beside the branch, where Mary's dress had caught, he found something lodged beneath it, a thin strip of cloth, white lace, the edge of a sleeve carefully torn. And caught, and when he pulled it free, he saw the edge had been knotted, twisted like a ligature, and the implication set fire behind his eyes. He returned to town with the strip of cloth folded in his coat, but he told no one, not yet, because what could he say? What could he prove? A knotted piece of fabric is not a crime, and an 8-year-old boy is not a killer, and yet in his heart he knew he had just held in his hands the first true evidence that Timothy Caldwell was not simply adjacent to death, but orchestrating it. But what gnawed at Harding even deeper than the girl's death was the reaction from the animals. The Pattersons' chickens, who had always grown agitated around the boy, now refused to approach the fence, lying all together, their feathers puffed out, their eyes wide and watchful, and their silence at night a kind of omen. And when Sarah Caldwell spoke softly to Harding, a week later, her voice low and cracked, she said the horses won't go near him, not even with sugar, and Thomas says it's just bad training, but they bolt when he walks near, and I think they know, I think they smell something on him, something we don't. And Harding did not argue, because he had seen it himself. The way animals reacted, not with fear exactly, but with avoidance, a primal kind of recoil, not from threat, but from wrongness, and he thought of battlefield dogs who could smell gangrene before the wound turned black, thought of the horses that would not carry dying men, and wondered if perhaps the senses we had lost in civilization still lived quietly in beasts. The death of Mary Fletcher changed something in the town, not just the loss, but the aftermath. The way people looked at each other, now sideways glances and lowered voices, and the realization that something unseen had entered their world, something that could reach into the innocence of a child's laughter and silence it. And as Dr. Harding sat on his porch that night, glass of whiskey, untouched journal, open to a page he could not bring himself to fill, he wondered what other darkness the boy had brought with him, what shadows still crept behind those pale blue eyes, and what he might do next. It was the sound of buzzing that came first, low and constant, like a warning that no one heard, until it was too late. And when Henrik Lenn's body was found at the base of Devil's Bluff, the questions began before the morning, did questions whispered, with dry mouths and darting eyes, questions that always came back to the same name, not because anyone dared speak it aloud, but because his presence had become the common thread in a tapestry woven with blood and silence. Henrik had been a logger once, tall and thick, with a chest like an oak trunk and hands made for axes. But age and arthritis had bent him like a willow and driven him from the forests into slow retirement, his one joy the wild beehives that clung to the rock faces above Willow Creek. Hardy creatures like him, quiet, industrious, easily disturbed, but mostly left alone, the townsfolk had grown used to seeing. Henrik on his weekly climbs up Devil's Bluff, his silhouette framed against the sky, like some watchful spirit, tending to his hives, checking the health of the colonies, collecting honey with the same reverence others saved for communion. So when he didn't return home on Sunday evening, his absence was noted, but not feared, not until the next morning, when Timothy Caldwell was seen running down the lane from the bluffs, his shirt unbuttoned, his hands scratched, his hair matted with sweat and dirt, his voice calm but urgent as he told Samuel Patterson, "I saw Mr. Henrik's hat near the bluff. I called out, but he didn't answer. I think something's wrong." The group that climbed the bluff was small, Harding among them, boots slipping on the damp moss faces, drawn not from exertion, but from the weight of a growing dread. And when they reached the base of the outcrop, they found Henrik lying on his back, arms twisted beneath him, neck bent at an angle that left no room for doubt, eyes wide, mouth slightly parted, as though he had seen something just before the fall, something that had surprised him, not scared, not shocked, but confused. And scattered around him on the damp rocks were bees, dozens, maybe hundreds, their small bodies. Still their wings curled, their stingers exposed and useless. And that was what froze Harding more than the corpse, more than the broken bones. The bees should not have been there, not in those numbers, not in that place. Bees do not follow a falling man. They do not die with their keeper. Timothy stood at the edge of the clearing, watching from a distance, his pale blue eyes unreadable, his face still, and Harding felt again that flicker of unease that lived behind the boy's every movement, like a shadow that never obeyed the light. A child said later, "I was coming back from town. I took the path along the creek, and I saw his hat caught on a thorn bush, and when I couldn't find him, I climbed down to look. But the bush he pointed to was 10 feet from the bluff, and the hat lay beneath it pinned by a stone, as though it had been placed, not fallen." And when Harding asked how he'd gotten down to the body so quickly, Timothy answered simply, "I climbed." And when asked why he hadn't gone for help immediately, he said, "I wanted to make sure he wasn't just hurt. I thought maybe he was still alive." That night, Harding wrote in his journal, "The fall was from a height sufficient to kill the position of the body, consistent with impact, but the presence of bees is unexplained. Hives at the top of the bluff remain undisturbed. The swarm appears to have been confined to the area around the corpse, implying post-mortem presence or artificial introduction." And then beneath that he wrote one line in a darker ink than the rest. Timothy arrived with scratches on both hands, no explanation offered. The town buried Henrik quickly, as was custom, wrapped in a shroud soaked in beeswax to keep the flies off, and buried him in the earth beneath, the same bluff he'd climbed for years. And during the service, Harding again watched the boy the way he moved through the mourners, with practiced stillness, the way he held his hat to his chest at just the right angle, the way his eyes never drifted to the coffin once, and when the preacher spoke of the Lord's mercy and the mystery of his plan, Timothy closed his eyes, not in prayer, but in mimicry. It was 3 days after the funeral when Eleanor Patterson visited Harding's home, her face pale, her hands shaking. She told him the chickens won't go near the edge of the property any more, not since that boy came by last week. They bunch up at the far end of the pen, like something's chasing them, but there's nothing there, and 2 of them died. Yesterday, necks broken clean, but there's no blood, no feathers, no sign of a fox or a weasel. It's like they just snapped. Harding visited her farm at dusk. The coop was silent, the hens still and tense, their eyes wide, their bodies pressed into corners, and when Timothy's name was spoken aloud, one of them screeched once and collapsed dead before his feet reached the straw. Harding knelt and examined the body. No visible trauma, but the neck was limp, the bones misaligned, a break clean and purposeful, done with force, but also precision. He returned to the bluff that night, alone, lantern in hand, wind pulling at his coat, the path to the top steep and littered with loose stone and dried leaves. And when he reached the hives, he found them as they had been, untouched, undisturbed, but he noticed something strange in the dirt near the cliff's edge. Small prints, child-sized, the pattern erratic, as though someone had paced back and forth repeatedly, and in the loose soil at the very edge were deeper indentations, as if someone had knelt there waiting. And when he crouched low to examine the hive closest to the ledge, he saw that the bark near its base had been scratched, not by animals, but by a blade, thin, deep markings that formed a spiral curling around the trunk, like a signature or a symbol. And suddenly he remembered Timothy's question from weeks before, "How do you know if someone's really dead?" Back in his study, Harding opened his journal again, flipping back through the pages, rereading his notes on the girl in the creek, on the way the calf had wandered so far from its herd. On the way, the bees had swarmed the corpse, but not the hive. On the boy who was always polite, always helpful, always watching, and he saw the pattern, clear now, not in the deaths alone, but in their structure, the planning, the positioning, the explanations that made just enough sense to be accepted by those who needed to believe in innocence. He wrote, "Timothy Caldwell may not be what he seems, He may be acting on impulses not yet understood by science, but consistent with traits observed in men much older who kill without anger, without passion, without remorse, his interest in the process of death not as tragedy, but as mechanism suggests a detachment beyond his years. But the journal did not ease his mind. It only made the silence louder, made the shadows deeper made the boy's face harder to look at, without wondering what lay behind it. And in the days that followed, as autumn crept over the valley and the leaves turned the color of old blood, Harding began to notice the people of Sedalia walking faster heads lower doors, locked earlier the way conversations stopped when children passed by, and always the way the animals stared at Timothy when he walked past, as if they saw something the rest of them could not. When the next death came, it would shatter what remained of their belief in coincidence. And Harding knew even then that it would come because boys like Timothy Caldwell do not stop. They learn, they adapt, and then they perfect. It was the cold that made them search harder the third night, the kind of cold that seeps into your joints and stiffens your bones, the kind that carries the whisper of something watching just beyond the lantern light. And by the fourth morning, the woods no longer felt like home. They felt like a waiting mouth, and the name on everyone's lips, even if they never spoke it out loud, was Timothy, because it was Timothy who found Jacob Mills, or rather it was Timothy who said he heard something like crying coming from an old well, that no one had thought to check something half a mile from where the boy had vanished, something buried beneath fallen logs and brush that seemed arranged not by wind or storm, but by careful, deliberate hands. Jacob had gone missing the way children do with innocence and curiosity and trust. He had been playing near the tree line behind his family's cabin, chasing dragonflies with a tin pail and a broken twig sword, and when his mother called him for supper, only silence answered, no scream, no cry, just absence, and the sun slipping behind the hills like it too wanted nothing more to do with what was coming. The search was quick to start, but slow to progress. The woods were vast, and the paths unmarked, and the underbrush thick with years of decay and misdirection, and the fear that settled over the community was not just of losing a child, it was fear born from a pattern they were too afraid to name the way. 3 deaths had come in less than 6 weeks, each with the same witness, each with the same pale blue eyes watching from the edges. Timothy volunteered to help, of course. He always did. He walked beside the men with their rifles and their dogs and their heavy boots, and he never complained, never slowed down. He carried no food, no water, just a small notebook and a length of string. He used to mark the trees. He said he'd learned the technique from his uncle, Thomas, who had used it during his time in the war to keep from getting lost in unfamiliar woods. He never got lost, Timothy said softly. When Harding asked about it, always knew where he was, even in the dark, even when the smoke was thick and the trees looked like ghosts. And then, on the 4th morning, before the sun had fully risen, Timothy arrived at the Mills cabin, his boots muddy, his face flushed, but not from exertion, from something else, something like pride, he said. I think I found something. I was near the ridge, past the blackberry thicket, and I heard something like crying, like someone whispering, and when I followed the sound I found a well, an old one covered in logs. I think maybe Jacob's down there. They ran faster than they had in days, Harding among them, heart pounding not just from the hope that the boy might be alive, but from the fear that once again Timothy was at the center of the storm, and when they reached the site, they found the logs just as Timothy described, laid out in a way that seemed almost artistic, as if someone had tried to hide the opening while still leaving clues for the right eyes to see. Jacob was alive, barely curled at the bottom of the well, his lips cracked, his skin pale, his eyes fluttering in a body that had not had water in 4 days. Harding descended into the pit with a rope around his waist, barking instructions through clenched teeth, hands trembling as he checked the boy's pulse and felt the slow flutter of life still clinging to the child like dew clings to dying grass, and when they brought him up the cry that escaped his mother was not joy. It was something older, something that came from the part of the soul that knows. Joy does not always last. Jacob died hours later despite Harding's efforts, despite the prayers and the poultices and the boiled water. He died as the sun set casting gold over the hills like a mockery of hope, and as the family wept, Timothy sat in the corner of the cabin, not crying, not praying, just watching lips-moving eyes fixed on Jacob's body in a way that made Harding's skin crawl, because it was not grief, not even curiosity, it was study. Later, when Harding walked the woods again, retracing Timothy's path, he found that the blackberry thicket had not been disturbed, no broken branches, no signs of passage, and the logs over the well had been arranged in a pattern symmetrical, precise. 2 thick branches forming an X across the mouth, 3 smaller ones wedged beneath as braces, the kind of structure that would take strength, time, and intention to build. And in the soft earth nearby were footprints, small, bare, and facing the well, as if whoever stood there had spent a long time watching. Harding returned to the cave near the creek, the one Timothy had mentioned in passing a place. He said he went to think, to be alone, and what he found there turned thought into certainty. Animal bones, sorted by size and species, tied with twine and labeled with strips of cloth, sketches pinned to the rock walls, drawn with charcoal and ash, some of animals, some of humans, always in pain, always in stages of death, and among them a sketch of Jacob at the bottom of a well, eyes closed, mouth open, limbs sprawled exactly as Harding had seen him hours earlier, and beneath it, in Timothy's careful script, where the words respiration ceased approximately 10 minutes after extraction, pallor increased steadily from extremities inward, death appeared. Peaceful subject did not vocalize. He took the drawing home that night, hid it between the pages of his journal, and locked the drawer with a key. He kept on a chain around his neck, and when he looked in the mirror, he saw a man no longer confused, but afraid, not of what he didn't know, but of what he did, because knowing meant responsibility. Knowing meant he could no longer pretend. Timothy Caldwell was just a strange boy touched by tragedy. Knowing meant something had to be done. The funeral was quieter this time. Fewer mourners, fewer words, fewer illusions. Timothy stood beside his aunt Sarah, his hands folded, his head bowed. But again Harding saw the truth, the dryness of his eyes, the way his fingers tapped a silent rhythm against his thigh, the way he glanced at the coffin, like one might glance at a puzzle they had already solved. And then a week later, Harding heard the question again, not from Timothy, but from another child, one of the McAllister boys who had been playing near the Caldwell property. He said, "Timothy showed us a trick with frogs. He says if you hold them just right, they stop moving, but they don't die, not for a while. They just lay there real still until you're done looking." That night Harding wrote without stopping. He filled 5 pages with observations, theories, fears, each word heavier than the last. He wrote that Timothy's knowledge of the human body exceeded that of most apprentices, that his fascination with suffering was not born of curiosity, but of compulsion, that the well had not been found, it had been used, and that the logs had not concealed Jacob by accident. They had kept him hidden until he was weak enough to die. He wrote that Timothy's ability to manipulate adults, his mastery of politeness and obedience and respect, was not a defense mechanism, but a weapon that he wore innocence, like a mask, not to hide from danger, but to hunt beneath it. And he ended the entry with one line that shook him more than all the rest. Timothy Caldwell is not learning how to kill. He is practicing. It began with the chickens, always the chickens, because they were easy to blame on foxes or weasels or some passing sickness. But the truth was in the way they died, not in panic, not in blood, but in silence and symmetry, heads twisted at precise angles, necks broken clean, without signs of struggle or panic, feathers undisturbed, bodies laid out as if placed, not fallen. And Ella Lenina Patterson noticed. First, she noticed because she was the kind of woman who counted things and wrote them down in a little blue book by the kitchen stove, and she knew when 17 chickens vanished in 6 weeks that it was not nature, it was something else, something that walked like a boy, but moved like a thought that shouldn't be spoken. She told her husband, of course. Samuel said it was hawks or coyotes, or maybe the neighbor's dog, and she nodded, but said nothing, because she'd already seen the prints near. The coop's small bare feet, not running, not chasing, just standing still, and facing the birds as if watching, as if waiting, and the dog never came close again, not after it whimpered for 3 nights, straight, and refused to leave the cellar, even when tempted with meat. Dr. Harding was visiting for Thomas Caldwell's, back when Ella Lenina mentioned the chickens in passing the way people do when they want to say more, but need permission first. And Harding listened and asked if he could see the coop, and when he did, he crouched beside one of the fresh bodies, a hen still warm, the break at the base of the skull surgical too, clean for teeth, too precise for claws, and when he opened the bird, he found nothing wrong. No sickness, no rot, no signs of disease, just death. Like a switch had been flipped and life had vanished. It wasn't just the Pattersons. The Wickhams lost 3 calves. 2 of them strangled in the night, ropes looped around their throats, in ways that made no sense. Calves don't tie knots. Calves don't hang themselves. And yet there they were, eyes, bulging tongues, blue ropes pulled so tight they left marks in the wood where they'd been tied, and James Wickham said he saw Timothy near the fence the morning before one calf died, said the boy waved like always, said, "Good morning, sir," like he meant it, like he was glad to see a man who would find something broken the next day. Harding visited the Wickhams too, and the Dunhams and the Fields and the Sampsons, and everywhere he went the pattern grew stronger. Always close to the Caldwell farm, always near the edges, always too clean, too quiet, no blood, no tracks, just things that should not die simply ceasing to be, and always someone saying, "I think I saw the Caldwell boy near here," not doing anything, just watching. There was the Dunham bull, a beast of enormous strength found in a ditch, legs, broken spine, twisted, and not a single mark on the fence. No struggle, no noise, just the sound of flies the next morning. And when Robert Dunham looked at the body, he swore. The bull's eyes were open, not in terror, but in confusion, as if even in death it didn't understand what had happened. Harding started walking more, started watching the edges of things, and he saw Timothy more often too, always alone, always moving with purpose, never running, never idle. He carried a stick sometimes. Not a toy, not a branch, a tool smooth and sharpened, at one end like a probe, and once Harding saw him crouched near a tree with a squirrel in his hands, the animal still twitching, and Timothy whispering something to it, not words, not prayers, something lower, something without shape. When Timothy saw him, he smiled, stood up, wiped his hands on his trousers, and said, "Good afternoon." Dr. Harding, the squirrel limp in his other hand, eyes glazed, body still, and the doctor said nothing, just nodded and walked past, because the words that came to mind were not ones he could say aloud, not in daylight, not with the sun shining and the birds singing and the boy's pale blue eyes staring right through him. Later Harding wrote in his journal that there is a difference between killing and studying, and that Timothy Caldwell seemed incapable of the former and consumed by the latter. He wrote that Timothy didn't kill for anger or fear or hunger. He killed for data, for patterns, for understanding the way a scholar dissects a text or a chemist boils a compound down to its essence. He wrote that the child lacked something fundamental, the mechanism that turns pain into guilt or horror into empathy, and what remained was a clean blank space filled with equations made of flesh. It was then Harding began to suspect that the animal deaths were not accidents, or even practice. They were controlled variables, a way to test response, to test pressure, to test silence, because animals make noise. When they die, they fight, they scream, unless you find the exact point where they don't. And Timothy was looking for that point over and over again, in feathers and fur and muscle and bone. One night Harding returned to the well where Jacob had died and sat beside it with a lantern and a notebook and listened. Not for ghosts, not for voices, but for understanding. He watched the moon rise and the wind push the grass, and in the silence he imagined a boy crouched here, arranging logs, calculating angles, listening for the moment when thirst became weakness, and weakness became silence. He thought about the drawings in the cave, the ones he hadn't told anyone about, not yet, the ones that showed not just animals, but humans labeled, measured, dissected, sketched with a precision that suggested not imagination but memory. And he wondered if Timothy saw people the same way he saw animals, as systems, as puzzles, as temporary containers for interesting failures. And then there was the fox. It was found by the Millers dead near their chicken run, but untouched, not a mark, not a wound, just lying in the dirt, like it had fallen asleep with its eyes open. And the coroner, a simple man with rough hands and a bottle in his pocket, said maybe poison, but Harding opened the animal himself and found no froth, no swelling, no signs of toxin, just stillness in the organs, like they'd been told to stop all at once, and obeyed. He asked Mrs. Miller if she'd seen anyone near the property. She hesitated, then said, well, the Caldwell boy came by the day before. He said he was looking for mushrooms. I didn't think nothing of it. He was polite, said ma'am, and thanked you just like always. Harding left without a word that time, because the pieces were falling too fast, and every conversation felt like a whisper behind a closed door, a warning too late to matter. And when he returned home, he took the journals, the sketches, the scraps of cloth from the cave, and locked them in a box and buried the key beneath the old elm, because there were things in those pages that should not be read more than once, things that changed the shape of silence and made a man look over his shoulder, even in his own kitchen. He stopped sleeping then, not fully. He would doze for an hour and wake with the image of a rabbit's eye looking back at him unblinking. Dissected, sketched, labeled subject ceased vocalizing at minute 7, and he began to understand that Timothy Caldwell was not simply a disturbed child or a budding killer. He was something older, something colder, something that had learned how to wear the skin of a boy to move among men without raising alarm, and that he was learning, still growing, still testing limits, and the bodies of animals were only the beginning. It was late November when Dr. Harding began to speak with Timothy directly, in ways more deliberate than before. His visits to the Caldwell farm had become routine under the pretense of checking Thomas's injury, but each time his eyes were not on the patient. They were on the boy, watching the way he moved, the way he listened, the way his hands folded in his lap. Too still, too patient for a child. His age, Harding began to craft questions small, at first designed to seem casual, things like, have you helped your uncle with the animals lately? Or what do you do when you're alone? And Timothy always answered, politely, clearly, precisely, never with hesitation and never with fear. Then came the deeper questions, the ones that held knives behind their backs. Harding would ask, have you ever seen something? Di, have you ever wondered what happens in the moment between breathing and not? And Timothy would nod solemnly, as if these were old thoughts, not frightening, not strange, and say things like, sometimes I think about how long a body stays warm after the heart stops, or if someone can still hear for a little, while even if their eyes are closed. And Harding would write these answers down in silence later at night, when the fire had burned low, and he could not tell if the shiver he felt was from cold or from the boy's words crawling into his bones. Timothy never asked why the doctor asked. Such questions never seemed to find them odd, and one evening after a long silence at the table he asked Harding in return, have you ever seen someone pretend to be dead? Harding looked at him and said, what do you mean? And the boy smiled a little, not cruel, not playful, just thoughtful, and said, I mean really pretend, like their chest barely moves and their lips go blue, but their eyes twitch a little, and you know they're still in there, and you wonder if they feel everything or nothing. Harding swallowed and said, yes, in war we saw that sometimes men pretending, hoping that Bullet would pass over, but most weren't pretending. They just weren't dead yet, and Timothy nodded and said, "I think it's important to know the difference." And then he excused himself and went outside, and Harding sat for a long time with his hand clenched around his pen, not writing, not moving, just thinking about what kind of child would find that question important. Later in December, Harding began to test the boy not with questions, but with lies, subtle falsehoods, crafted to mislead. He told Timothy that sometimes a man's heart can stop for 10 minutes and still start again, that brain death takes hours, that corpses can twitch for days, and Timothy never argued, never corrected him, but his eyes flickered just slightly, and his head tilted as if filing the error away, as if sorting truth from fiction without needing to say a word. And Harding realized, with a slow creeping dread, that the boy already knew the answers that he wasn't asking to learn, but to confirm, to calibrate. He told the boy about battlefield amputations, about the way men screamed, or didn't, how sometimes you could see them slipping away, even while their mouths still begged for water. And Timothy listened, not horrified, not moved, but fascinated eyes fixed and hands folded. And after one particularly grim story, he asked, did their mouths foam when they screamed, or was it dry and cracking? And Harding had to look away, because there was something in that voice that sounded too much like memory. It was during this time that Harding began to dream of voices, dreams of cold, damp rooms of eyes, watching from the dark of bones, arranged not by decay, but by intention, of hands too small to be adult, too clever to be innocent, moving across flesh, with the curiosity of a surgeon and the joy of a child solving a riddle. He began to believe that Timothy's mind was not empty of empathy, but full of something else, something that grew best in silence and fed on fear, not fear from others, but his own, as if the boy could sense it, could taste it, and when Harding came near Timothy, would sometimes smile, not with his mouth, but with his eyes, as if they shared a secret neither was ready to name. And then there was the night of the storm. Lightning pealed across the hills. Rain drove into the earth like nails. And Harding sat in the Caldwell kitchen, watching the boy across the table. Sarah and Thomas asleep upstairs, the lantern guttering. And Timothy simply sitting unmoving, watching the flame. And after a long while he said quietly, "Doctor, do you think some people are just born different? Not broken, just meant to be something else?" And Harding said, "Different? How?" And Timothy said, "Like, they're supposed to see what others can't, and touch things that aren't supposed to be touched, and take things apart, not to hurt them, but to understand." And Harding said, "Who are you talking about?" And the boy smiled and said, "I think you already know." The next morning Harding returned to the cave, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity, he told himself. He needed more evidence, something undeniable, and what he found made the journal entries seem like children's stories. In the back of the cave, behind the sketches and bones, was a new wall lined with markings like calendars, but not with days, with names, initials, dates, and beside each a series of lines, tally marks, some with 3, some with 5, some with more, and at the end of the wall a blank space, empty, but not untouched, as if waiting. And Harding ran his fingers over the rough stone and felt something carved faintly beneath the surface, a name, his own, not yet inked, just scratched once. When he turned to leave, he saw the boy's writing on the wall behind him, not the wall of markings, but a loose board that had fallen, revealing a phrase scrawled in charcoal behind it. It read, "Doctor watches, doctor learns, doctor wonders." And then beneath that, in smaller writing, "Sometimes he sees what he's not supposed to see." And Harding fled, not because of fear of death, but because he realized in that moment that Timothy had always known he was being studied, had allowed it, had fed it like bait on a hook to see how deep Harding would go. And now the hook was set, and the line was pulled tight. He burned the journals 2 nights later in the field behind his home, page by page, the smoke rising into a sky too calm for what it carried, and he watched the flames without relief, because the knowledge did not burn with the paper it remained. lodged inside him like a shard under the skin, and when people asked why he stopped practicing medicine in the spring of 1867, he told them his hands were no longer steady, but the truth was his mind was no longer his own. The Caldwell farm stood quiet for a time, then sold to a man from St. Louis, who never stayed more than a month. No reason given, no complaint filed. He simply left and never returned. And the cave collapsed during a storm, or was collapsed, no one could say for sure. And Timothy Caldwell vanished one day, not ran away, not kidnapped, simply gone, as if the earth had folded around him like a blanket. And when the townsfolk asked Sarah and Thomas, they simply said he must have wandered off, and Harding knew that was a lie, but said nothing, because by then the silence had settled over everything like a fog. Years past the war was forgotten, the town rebuilt, but sometimes children spoke of a boy with pale eyes in the woods of rabbits who screamed once and then were silent of dreams they couldn't wake from, and mothers told them not to speak of such things, and fathers laughed too loudly when they did. And Dr. Samuel Harding died in 1883 with a locked box under his bed and a journal hidden inside the wall, and when the box was opened decades later by a boy who should have known better, the journal was blank, every page untouched except the last, which read only this: "If you are reading this, then you know, and if you know, then you've seen his eyes, and if you've seen his eyes, then it's already too late, because the boy never left. He only learned how to walk without being seen, how to smile without being known, how to listen and wait, and remember that silence is not empty. It is watching, and somewhere still he waits, waiting to understand us, one piece at a time."